Hello, boys and girls, ladies and gents. This is DafubFilm&TV, and today I have another review for you. This is a review of something that I only recently became aware of, not long before it was actually released. This is as far as I'm aware, straight to Blu-ray movie. I do not believe it's being streamed anywhere. It hasn't been broadcast on either broadcast television or on cable or satellite. And the name of the movie is Babylon 5 The Road Home. Babylon 5 is an IP that's now rapidly getting on 30 years of age. I think it first hit the air with a straight to kind of TV pilot slash TV movie called Babylon 5 The Gathering, which I believe came out in 93, and then the show I believe started being broadcast. Babylon 5, the TV show, began being broadcast, I think around 1994, maybe 93. I can't remember off the top of my head. Babylon 5 is for me it's a golden oldie at this stage. I remember watching it back in the day when it was brand new. It was the first television sci-fi show, in my opinion, to kind of arise to arise to in any meaningful way challenge Star Trek, and that actually ran for a meaningful length of time. There were a couple of other shows like A Space Above and Beyond back in the 1990s, which I thought was very good, but that got cancelled after one season, and there might be one or two others that escape my memory at this point. But Babylon 5 ran for, I think, about 5 seasons, about 20 usual broadcast for television in the US at the time, 22 episode seasons for 5 seasons. It is, it should be, I would consider to be what would have been 21st Century Fox slash Fox Television's answer to Star Trek. It is a very, very, very good show. It gave the kind of Star Trek: The Next Generation would have ended in 1994, if my memory serves me correctly. So this would have been on the air for like a year, maybe a bit more than that, by the time Next Gen came to an end, and it gave its successors, Star Trek: Deep Space Nine and Voyager, a serious run for their money. I would consider Babylon 5 to be, compared to those two shows, well, I think my personal favorite Star Trek show is probably Deep Space Nine, for a number of reasons I won't get into here. But Babylon 5 was probably, in my view, the best kind of pure science fiction television show to originate from the 1990s, and probably for a couple of decades before that. Certainly that was completely original. You probably have to go back to the original series of Star Trek in the 60s to, in my opinion, get something as good, or certainly as good, and that lasted as long as it did. Babylon, there was a bit of controversy at the time because B5 would have come out either the same time or just prior to Deep Space Nine, and there are some significant similarities. Both are set on space stations. Deep Space Nine is set next to a wormhole that's we later first is thought to be naturally occurring, and then later on find out is made by sentient beings. Again, I won't spoil that show for anyone who hasn't seen it. I highly recommend watching DS9 from beginning to end. But Babylon 5, was similar in that regard. Space station, method of traveling through of interstellar travel was kind of wormhole-esque. And so there might have been some accusations of one ripping off the other. I can't remember which came out first. But Babylon 5 was very much its own thing. And I would argue that it was a precursor to modern streaming shows, in that it was a highly serialized show. This is in, the era of, episodic television, particularly one could argue the kind of the golden age with Star Trek of episodic broadcast television. In other words, you've an episode starts, it's 45 minutes long. The story begins on the first minute of the episode and ends with the final minute of the episode. DS9, or not DS9, sorry, Babylon 5 in comparison has story threads that start in the Gathering pilot slash TV movie, and in the first season of the show that aren't resolved until season 4 or 5. And it just gives you an idea that it was very, very serialized television when that was, and storytelling when that was incredibly rare to non-existent at the time. And one could argue that DS9, or not that DS9 was influenced by Babylon 5, because as that show continued on over time, its storytelling became more serialized, particularly in the last couple of seasons. I won't go into the specifics here, but it's certainly possible that Babylon 5 had a significant influence on DS9 in terms of bringing a more serialized storytelling to the table. And I think it's one of the main advantages of DS9 over Next Gen and the original series, that becomes more serialized over time in terms of its storytelling, and therefore stronger in that regard than either Next Generation or the original series, only for Voyager to come along, which is clearly a premise that was perfectly set for highly serialized storytelling that was instead completely episodic from day one, in my view, to the show's detriment. In other areas, Babylon 5 had a fantastic cast, many of whom have, now died. I mean, one of the bizarre things about it is that Next Gen started earlier and ended around the time the B5 got going, but pretty much every Next Gen cast member is still alive, while several of the core cast members from Babylon 5 are dead. I won't, go into the specifics or name names, but it was a fantastic cast, many of whom have sadly now passed on, quite surprisingly so, considering that they were, relatively young at the time when the show was on the air in the early to mid 90s. And yet the entire cast would, if they were all still alive, would certainly be younger than Patrick Stewart is right now. Many of them would still be younger than many of the cast members of Next Gen, and yet they're all still alive. Yet the good few core cast members from Babylon 5 are dead. Outside of that, it was an incredibly well acted and well written show, certainly by the standards of the time. Yes, quality again would not stand up to, in the writing, would not stand up to modern standards, but that is to a degree the fact that they had to put out 22 episodes a season, which meant they just couldn't concentrate the kind of time on, massaging each episode to perfection, the way they can now. And also there was, again, runtime limitations where you'd be looking at an episode that was maybe 40-45 minutes long maximum, allowing for time for advertising and so on, that again do not apply today. In terms of, in that regard, it is, in my view, the kind of the most important and most significant new kind of science fiction IP, certainly television science fiction IP, to come out of the later stages, or the last gasp of the 20th century, aka the 1990s, but has been since Babylon 5 ended. And there is even a bit of a thing there. There were the people making it were believed that they were cancelled after the 4th season, or they wouldn't get renewed after the 4th season, only to get renewed for a 5th season. And so storytelling, was a bit messed up as a result of that. But even so, it's still, my opinion, a great show by the standards of the time. And the fact that there was a sequel series, Crusade, but that got cancelled after, I think it was 1 season, in my view, because they made a couple of key creative mistakes, which I won't get into, that kind of undermined the show from day one and meant that it didn't get to continue. But the fact that Fox, I'm not sure if it's owned by 20th Century Fox or Fox Television, or basically both now, both of which I believe are owned by Disney. I could be wrong on that though, so don't quote me on that. Although I think this movie is being made by Warner Brothers, so I'm not sure who owns what licensing where. It may have been made by Warner Brothers for Fox Television, back in the day. So I'm not going to go check that now. So if you want to do your own investigations, let me know. Or if you know all the answers already, let me know in the comments below. But this was, a fantastic IP. The fact that not much was done with it after its kind of heyday back in the 1990s has always been something of a head scratcher to me. Apparently, James Michael Straczynski said on Twitter recently that one of the reasons why so little was done with the IP was because there was a senior executive, either at Fox or Warner Brothers or both, who hated it and basically blocked any attempt to exploit it until that executive recently retired. And that block is now gone. If that's true, it's frankly madness. I mean, just from a money standpoint, the amount of money that could be made out of Babylon 5 today, if things were made to a high standard, the toys, the merchandising, everything else, video games, could or would be absolutely huge. But as it stands, I consider it the best kind of pure sci-fi show to have originated out of the 1990s. Better than Deep Space Nine, certainly better than Voyager. And there might be a couple of other things in the 1990s that came out that got cancelled. Again, Space Above and Beyond, I think, was great and should have gotten a lot more time than it did. But again, it's a great IP. It really should be, exploited more than it has been. And hopefully it will be with some degree of success going into the future. Now, as a background to this, James Michael Straczynski has been working on a reboot of the original show, and I assume the original kind of story arc, which, as an old school fan who has literally the entirety of the original show on DVD, although I haven't looked at it in quite some time, that is a bit, why would you, why would you, it's like, why would you, let's start trying to make, like, remake the original series of Star Trek or Next Gen with a completely new cast. It sounds to me, to be completely and utterly bonkers. And admittedly, I'm, something of a fan of the relatively recent Star Trek movies based on the original characters, but with a new cast. Although there are a lot of Trek fans out there who would consider that to be heretical in the extreme. I thought they were, sci-fi action movies. They were perfectly serviceable. I thought the casting of Spock in particular was fantastic. The actor's name again escapes me, but again, I thought certainly the first movie was perfectly entertaining. Not so fond of the ones that came after it, but it is what it is. But the idea of kind of remaking the original Babylon 5 show with the original characters, particularly considering that, again, with one assumes completely new cast playing those characters, it just doesn't, I mean, again, it makes no, to my mind, logical sense. And I if I were in their position, I wouldn't do it. But we'll see what happens with that. What we have here in front of us, and what I have watched today and what I'm reviewing for you, is again Babylon 5: The Road Home, which is an animated show or an animated movie set as a kind of a sequel or coming in after the events of the original series, with a significant number of the original cast members, certainly the surviving cast members, brought back to reprise their roles. My feelings on this movie are negatively affected by a number of things. First, I'm a fan of the OG series. Second, and it's nice to hear the voices of those original cast members that are still there, but again, a lot of the original B5 cast, like core characters, main parts of the ensemble, have died. Chief Security Officer Garibaldi was a major character in the show. I can't remember the name of the actor. I apologize. He's been dead for a while now. The station's doctor, who's again name I for both the character and the actor, again I can't remember. He died of apparently an aortic dissection when he was only 44 years old in like 2006. So he's been dead for quite a while. the actor who played Ambassador Jakar, who I will not try and pronounce his name, he died of cancer. He was a big smoker back in the 2000s as well. Like a good number of the kind of the main core cast and some of the standout kind of actors in the show, particularly the actor who played Ambassador Jakar, are dead. And so when you have these characters turn up, and this is from someone who hasn't actually watched the show in quite some time, and even I kind of found it quite jarring, kind of listening to these kind of different actors trying to do their voices. And the fact that you have kind of original cast members back, and none of them, to my mind, of the new voice actors covering for the deceased former cast members, does anywhere near, in my view, good enough a job. Now, in the case of Ambassador Jakar, I think it was the actor's name, Andreas Katoulas or something. I'm going to mispronounce his name. I apologize. That man had a very distinct accent, a very distinct way of speaking and a way of acting in terms of his dialogue. And it just, hearing this strange voice come out of that character's mouth was just weird. And this is one of the core problems, I think, with them trying to do a remake of the show. That Ambassador Jakar's arc is one of the best story arcs in the entire original show. And again, Andreas Katoulas, or however you pronounce his second name, again, I apologize, does a fantastic job. And I would go as far as to say that he's probably the single most standout role / actor in the entire show. Maybe, closely approximated by kind of his opposite, Lando Malari, who's Ambassador Malari, who's ambassador from the Centauri Republic, who's the actor's name again escapes me, but he's still alive. But getting you to have Ambassador Jakar in this movie and do it properly, you would have to have an actor who would either do that part either perfectly or get very, 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 very close. And no offense to the actor in the role, but he just doesn't do that. And the same is also a problem with Mia Furlan's character, Ambassador Delenn. She's from the former Yugoslavia, literally left before the former Yugoslavia broke up. And the actress voicing her tries to do this kind of semi kind of exotic kind of European Yugoslavian accent. And frankly, maybe does a better job than the actor voicing Jakar, but nowhere near enough. And their roles in this show are relatively small, all things considered. But it's just very, very jarring. It's not even just a question of, it's a different actor or actress voicing the role. They're not doing it to anywhere near a good enough standard to make it even just passable. And that hurts, in my view, whenever they're on screen, it hurts the movie. I also don't like the animation style. From day one, when I saw some of the kind of the publicity stills and then saw the trailer, was kind of it's basically kind of 3D graphics with cel shaded 2D art style on top of it. It's not it wasn't enough to put me off seeing the movie, but it's was an immediate, in my view, kind of negative against it. And here it doesn't look particularly good. Maybe it's relatively cost effective for them, relatively cheap, for them to do it, but it's still not. It's not an art style I like. This in itself wouldn't necessarily have been a problem if the rest of the movie was kind of animated to a relatively high standard, but it isn't. One of the actual single most weak area of the movie in terms of the animation and just the kind of just general visual pizzazz or lack thereof, and or direction and or cinematography, is the space combat sequences that you see in certain parts of the film. Babylon 5, when it was being broadcast on television back in the 1990s, was the first science fiction television show to go all CGI. In other words, there was no physical modeling or physical models like there would have been in the original series of Star Trek, like there were in all of Star Trek The Next Generation. And I think most, if not all, of Star Trek Deep Space Nine would have used physical prop models, with more and more CGI being used over the course of the show's run. And the same, how much it was used in Voyager, I don't know, but that was one area where Babylon 5 had a huge advantage, because since it was completely CGI, that allowed space sequences to be shot from angles that was not technically or possible or feasible using physical models back in the day. So you get all these kind of interesting angles and shots during the space sequences, during space battle / combat. It allowed for a level kind of cinematography and direction of those and choreography of those space battle sequences that would have been completely unseen certainly in television up until that time period, possibly also movies as well. Well, the first all CGI movie with space battles was, I think, what was it called? Not the name escapes me. CGI movie that used CGI in all the space sequences. The last something, I'm gonna say The Last Starfighter, that's it, which came out, I think, early to mid 1980s, set in a trailer park where there was this arcade machine which was actually there to test unknowing people to see if they were good enough to be recruited into a space force protecting the good guys against the evil empire. Only one movie. I consider it a 1980s classic. The CG looked actually pretty. It's basic and bare bones, even compared to Babylon 5 in certain regards, but it holds up well because of it. I'd well recommend anyone going out and who hasn't seen the movie The Last Starfighter, finding themselves a copy or finding it on streaming and watching it. I think it was an early to mid 1980s kind of PG-13 sci-fi classic that's well worth going out, or well worth seeking out and viewing it. But in terms of television, Babylon 5 was the first all CGI space sequence television show, and it showed. I mean, they were, again, angles, space battle choreography, and just scenes set in space in general that were just not technically viable on Next Generation, or even most, if not all, of the run of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Voyager, I'm not quite so sure. They might have used a kind of a hybrid of I'm certain later in seasons of Deep Space Nine they would have used a hybrid of CGI and physical models. I'm sure they used a hybrid of CGI and physical models on Next Gen, but the complete lack of any dependence on physical models in Babylon 5 did give it a significant advantage. And one of the consequences of this is that you see kind of battle sequences, for instance, involving the Star Fury fighters, which probably the most iconic ship from that show, which you never saw anything like it in Star Trek. Things like the fighters rotating on their own axis while they're still heading in the direction they were initially going at, to shoot backwards at the baddies who were chasing them and stuff like that. And it was all kind of done to what was at that time, for science fiction television, a revolutionary standard. Back in the early to mid 1990s, again, the show ran, I think, from when The Gathering came out as the pilot, either in 93 or 94, all the way, I think the show ran 4 or 5 seasons, so it would have been 1998, that kind of 99 when it was cancelled. I can't remember off the top of my head. But, stress the but part, The where this comes back again back to the movie, the movie, which is again, it's an animated film, but it's clearly kind of 2D paint thrown on top of 3D graphics. There's almost, as far as I can tell, they don't exploit that at all. In fact, I would go as far as to say that these are the worst kind of space flight slash battle sequences that have come out of the Babylon 5 IP to date. Maybe they were just being cheap, cutting corners and so on, but that kind of spectacle was a major kind of, notable box that was ticked for Babylon 5 that this movie completely lacks. There are space sequences in it, there are space fighting sequences in it, but they look low budget. They don't, they're clearly using 3D graphics, at least partially, if not completely, throughout the entire movie, but they don't appear to use it at all to do. I mean, there's not one space sequence, or let alone space battle sequence, in the entire, again, animated movie that would live up to the standard, particularly set by the later seasons of Babylon 5, which I think is, considering that those sequences, there are space battle sequences in there, is a significant, from my standpoint, negative. They've also insisted on redesigning the big shadow ships. Why they've done this, I don't know. It's not a complete redesign, but they have added things to it, to the kind of the shadow mothership that you see in the fighting battle sequences, that significantly, in my view, detract from the overall design and the overall kind of aesthetic of the shadow vessels. That again negatively affects every scene that they're in and every sequence that they're in, and again negatively kind of impacts the overall quality of the animated film. In terms of the rest of the movie itself, the story is rather simple, and it's a simple, straightforward kind of sci-fi, time jumping, alternative history slash reality jumping show. And in that, or time slash reality slash alternate reality kind of jumping story that you would find in science fiction TV shows, both back in the 90s and now, there are a variety of kind of jokes slash bits running through at least parts of the movie that I didn't find particularly funny, and would have been in line with Babylon 5 as it was back in the 1990s. But again, this is a show from the 1990s. Things have moved on, and those kind of jokes slash bits slash running gags to me felt kind of more than a bit old in the tooth. And I wouldn't, if they're kind of, again, kind of 1990s legacy elements to the storytelling and the writing, which hopefully will not, if the show is remade, will not be in the new show, because again, they were perfectly fine back in the 1990s. It's been more than 20 years since the show ended, and by this stage it's been basically a quarter of a century, give or take, since the show ended, and now they feel kind of outdated and kind of outmoded, and they detract from the movie. And so, I mean, I keep saying show, it feels like an animated long episode of Babylon 5, which in of itself isn't a negative. But when you take into account those kind of certain outmoded story elements, specifically around the kind of the running gags and the jokes in it, and then I'd have to rewatch it to go over the storytelling, but it doesn't do anything new from a storytelling perspective compared to what you would have seen in Babylon 5 back in the 1990s, but again, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And there are those out there who are saying that this is actually kind of setting up for the kind of original OG Babylon 5 audience, the remake, and that the remake is going to be set in kind of an alternative, like it doesn't expressly say this in the show, but spoiler warnings, it kind of sets out one of the alternative realities that is in this kind of long episode of Babylon 5, animated episode of Babylon 5. I won't specifically lay out the details of it, but it does come across as kind of a perfect starting point if you wanted to reboot the show but not have it a straight up copy of the original. And in a way that's a good thing, but in a way it's also, again, this is a bad thing. If if this movie is badly affected by the fact that certain key cast members from the original show are dead and therefore are not reprising their roles, and this is negatively affecting this animated movie, I cannot see for the life of me how they could keep Ambassador Jakar and in any way, shape, or form whatsoever, let alone have him redo the story, his kind of arc over the course of the original show, and have it not ending up in an inferior remake of the original, because I just don't. I mean, they might be able to find an actor who is talented enough, who is able enough, who's able to mimic the accent of the original actor, and who is up to the job of portraying that role to the standard it needs to be portrayed to. And if they pull it off, it'll be a miracle, but it's a miracle, and therefore I think it's unlikely. And the same is true if they're recasting Lando Malari, if they're recasting a number of kind of key roles in the remake, which I assume they're recasting all of them. Some of the more lead actors or characters and the actors are still alive. They could be recast, but there are certain characters that just so stand out from the kind of the norm of television in general and science fiction television in general as well from that era. And even now, again, particularly Ambassador Jakar and Lando Malari, I don't see how you recast those two characters successfully. I mean, if you could do it with one of them, it should be a miracle. If you could do it with both, it might be so reality distorting, so statistically improbable, that it could cause the universe itself to collapse in on itself. I mean, it's that unlikely that they'd be able to successfully recast both of those roles, particularly if they've got the same kind of story arcs for both those characters that they did in the original series. And I'm again going back to the original series, and again the issue I have with the animated series in terms of the writing, with the running gags running through it and the kind of jokes in it that feel dated. I would be a bit concerned. I mean, hopefully, James Michael Straczynski, he's a very, very talented man, credit where credit is due, but I hope he isn't allowed to write the show from the ground up himself. I hope he has a writing team around him, preferably people that have more experience writing modern serialized television for streaming shows, as an example, because a simple straight up remake, or not that much, or alternate universe remake of Babylon 5 with the same standard of writing that was back then, it was very, very good at the time. That's why I consider it a classic, but it's not necessarily up to snuff for now. If James Michael Straczynski tweaks a couple of things, timelines and so on, for how his remake of Babylon 5 goes, but does effectively writes it to the same style in the same way he did back in the 1990s, the show may well be very well written, but it will feel dated. And to a degree, again, because of the running gags, the jokes in this animated movie, it does feel dated in terms of the writing. Outside of that, can I think of any other criticism? I'd have to, because the main character jumps that you're following jumps around from one time zone or one time period in one kind of universe from another to another relatively, some relatively quickly, others he's around for longer. You don't necessarily spend enough time with any of the core characters to, particularly the more, no offense to the actors involved, more replaceable roles slash actors to be able to tell, well, is Captain Sheridan, in terms of the performance, in terms of the writing, is he a bit dated now as well, or is he perfectly fine as he is? Same for Commander Ivanova and so on. You don't. Again, it is based mainly around Captain Sheridan, so you follow him around quite a bit. But in terms of the rest of the character, I thought he was perfectly fine. But in terms of the rest of the characters, I genuinely don't know. And so, if it ends up being kind of one assumes if it's a streaming show, bigger budget remake of a 1990s show where it's a pretty straight up remake, except they've tweaked a few things in terms of, time frames and various events have been changed. Again, my concern is that it'll feel maybe well written, but it'll feel horribly dated, which which would not bode well for the IP or for such a remake show lasting any meaningful length of time. I'll keep my opinion. I'll wait and see what JMS, again James Michael Straczynski comes up with. I think is this. I'm not sure if it's in this movie has been made by Warner Brothers or by Fox, or who exactly owns the IP and who exactly is making this. I should have checked before I started this review. Again, silly me. But I'll wait and see if it goes into production. I'll pay attention. I'll certainly watch the trailers, and I'll certainly probably watch the first season, depending on how long it is, and if it actually doesn't get cancelled, and to wait to form a full, complete opinion. But it needs to be the movie does give me concern in terms of, has the writing moved forward enough to be competitive in the modern environment overall? And I'll wait and see, but it does give me concern. And in terms of the concerns, and in terms of the actual movie itself, I don't like the animation style. The space sequences are nowhere near as good as those in the earlier seasons, let alone the later seasons of Babylon 5. And this isn't simply a question of, there's not enough explosions on screen. The camera work is poor. The choreography of the sequences is poor. I clearly appears to be a hybrid of 3D and 2D animation, or 3D animation with like 2D art slapped on top of it. And considering the level of 3D rendering tech, both software and hardware that's available now, and what was available in the first couple of seasons of Babylon 5, they were basically doing the CGI sequences on Amigas, with maybe installed upgrades like extra RAM or whatever it happened to be. That gives you an idea as to how basic the technology was available to them at the time. They can do an awful lot better now, even within the budget constraints I'm sure that were on this movie. And it's the space sequences are poor, the camera work in them is poor, those sequences are just poor across the board, and that negatively affects it. The changes they made to the Shadow Mothership make it, I don't like them. They don't look good. And it's, as terms of an episode, it's perfectly serviceable. We've seen time travel episodes in Babylon 5 before. It doesn't do anything in the kind of time travel / alternate universe space. Doesn't do anything that is dramatically innovative or clever in any particular way. Again, straight out of the kind of the 1990s. And I think to a degree, at least, this was kind of aimed at the OG fans to kind of give them an explanation as to why the remake of Babylon 5 is different in the ways that it's different. And hopefully if it sells well, again, that'll help with the, the confidence that I think is it Warner Brothers who make, I think Warner Brothers who made this. I don't know if they own the IP, Warner Brothers Animation, but it'll give them more confidence to actually make the show. But the writing needs to be better than it is in this. It needs to be more modern than it is in this, and the space sequences need to be, again, it's not a question of there's not big enough explosions or things aren't high enough resolution. Like the camera work in this for the space battle sequences compared to what you saw on the show are genuinely bad, like genuinely bad. And I don't understand why they are. Like it would be like if you're going to spend the money creating the 3D models of the Star Furies, they appear to have done. Looks like they've done it. They're at least pseudo 3D. Why wouldn't you do the cinematography properly, the camera work properly for the sequences when they're flying about the place doing their thing? So anyway, that's my view on Babylon 5: The Road Home. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video. Engagement through comments and likes is a very important to getting me more subscribers and more views, so that it'll be actually worth the effort to continue to make content. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. And if you haven't already rung the bell to get more content, to be notified when more content is uploaded ready for your consumption, please ring the bell. This is Dafub21. It's not, not displeased, but I'm not particularly pleased either with Babylon 5: The Road Home. Toodaloo.